Remember the Alamo? This was a common war cry in what is ironically one of the more forgotten wars in American history. The Mexican-American War was a conflict that took place between 1846 to 1848 and was the first war in America's history that took place primarily on foreign soil. The war resulted in Mexico losing half of its land and is considered by many historians to be a precursor to the United States Civil War. Welcome to Crazy Histories, where we bring you the craziest and weirdest facts from human history. Some of the things discussed in this video may be offensive or disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. Causes of the war. Like we mentioned before, the Mexican-American War started in 1846, but the start of the conflict can be traced back to 1836, when Texas gained independence from Mexico, though Mexico did not recognize them as their own country. They wanted to join the United States, but the northern states were against the idea of another pro-slavery state joining the Union and giving the South a political advantage. When James K. Polk ran for president in 1844, he ran on a platform of expansionism. He was a big believer in manifest destiny, or the idea that U.S. expansion was justified, inevitable, and a God-given right. Polk wanted to take the United States all the way to the Pacific Ocean. He wanted to re-annex Texas and to reoccupy Oregon. He managed to bring Texas into the Union in 1845, but Oregon was not made a state until 1859. Initially, Polk offered to buy much of the rest of the modern southwest region from Mexico in 1846, which they refused. When he was turned down, Polk decided to pick a fight. He knew that the United States had a bigger and more well-trained military with better weapons. He moved a company of U.S. troops, led by General Zachary Taylor, into a bit of land whose ownership was disputed between the two countries, and waited for Mexico to respond. The fighting begins. Already upset with the United States for making Texas a state, Mexico sent their own troops to the disputed area to attack the Americans. On April 25, 1846, the Mexican force made their attack. They managed to kill about a dozen Americans, and then laid siege to an American fort along the Rio Grande. Though Mexico had the advantage of surprise and siege, the Americans had better weapons and training, and so Taylor, along with some reinforcements, was able to claim victory in this battle. Just a few weeks later, on May 13, 1846, Congress officially declared war on Mexico, who never gave their own declaration. Both before and during the war, Polk had many critics because of it. They called it Mr. Polk's War, and saw it as a shameless land grab. Abolitionists and politicians in the North saw it as a way to tip the balance and add more slave states. One of the most prominent of these critics was a young Abraham Lincoln in his first year as congressman. This got him some allies, but just as many critics of his own. A newspaper in his home state of Illinois called him the Benedict Arnold of our district. During this time, only about 7,000 to 5,000 Mexicans lived north of the Rio Grande. Polk and the American forces, who were led by Colonel Stephen W. Kearny and Commodore Robert F. Stockton, easily captured this land for the U.S. Not all American soldiers supported the cause they were fighting for. Notably, this was true amongst Irish Catholic immigrants. Many defected from the American side and took up arms for the Mexican side. A man named John Riley gathered a group of 200 mostly Irish immigrants and formed a battalion called St. Patrick's Battalion, or San Patricios. They served in many of the major battles and became the elite artillery force for the Mexican army. Many of them were killed in the 1847 Battle of Churubusco. The Irishmen that survived were captured by the Americans, court-martialed, and 50 of them were executed. The Mexican response. Seeing how things were playing out, the Mexican government called in General Antonio Lopez to Santa Anna for help. Santa Anna was a charismatic leader who had been exiled to Cuba after being deposed as Mexico's dictator. He told Polk that if he was allowed to return to Mexico, that he would work to end the war and that it would be favorable for the U.S. Once arriving home, he immediately went back on his word, took control of the Mexican army, and led it into battle. Even after suffering a heavy loss at the Battle of Buena Vista in February of 1847, Santa Anna was made the president of Mexico in March. Unfortunately for the Mexicans, the Mexican forces were brave and ready to fight, but terribly undertrained and under-equipped. The Mexican officers were even worse. They often put politics above smart military moves. For example, Santa Anna disliked General Gabriel Valencia, and so refused to go to his aid at the Battle of Contreras. choosing to let the Americans win another battle rather than help his own people. The Battle and Siege of Chapultepec. This war saw the first major water attack taken by the U.S., and it would remain the largest American amphibious attack until World War II. To do this, the Navy custom-made surf boats that would ferry more than 10,000 soldiers to Veracruz, Mexico. The Mexican garrison in the town was woefully outnumbered and surrendered after a 20-day siege. From here, the American troops began the long march towards Mexico City, following a very similar route to the one that Hernán Cortés took as he was invading the Aztec Empire. The Mexican army tried to stop them with guerrilla tactics, but were only able to slow them down some. By September 1847, the troops made it to the Chapultepec Castle on the edge of Mexico City. This was the location of the Mexican Military Academy and was the most strategic point for the Americans to enter the city. The students here, along with the fully trained soldiers, put up a fight for a while, but then were ordered to abandon the castle. This event led to a famous Mexican legend. When the bombardment against the castle began and most Mexican troops fled, a group of 6 young military cadets, ranging in age from 13 to 19, remained to fight until the end. The legend says that one of these young men took the Mexican flag, wrapped it around himself, and jumped to his death. He did this so that the Americans wouldn't be able to capture it and use it as a piece of propaganda. Although the Mexicans lost the castle in the war, the teenagers were recognized, and there is a large monument in Mexico City to honor their bravery. Despite having the capital under siege, the Mexican forces still conducted guerrilla warfare attacks on the American supply chain. They had some success with this, but the war was already essentially over, and Santa Anna resigned from his presidential position. The Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo. On February 2, 1948, the war was officially over when diplomats from both sides gathered and signed the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo. This made the Rio Grande the official border between the two nations and recognized the U.S. annexation of Texas. Mexico ended up losing more than half of its land because of this treaty, all or part of what is now California, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, Colorado, Wyoming, Oklahoma, and Kansas, which is a whopping total of 525,000 square miles of land. The U.S. only paid $15 million for all of that land, though they were also required to pay for some of the damages of the war. You'd think that negotiating with a foreign government would gain the person that did it praise from their leaders. That wasn't the case here. Nicholas Trist, the man that negotiated the treaty on POLK'S behalf, was fired as soon as he returned from negotiations. Polk did initially send him to do exactly what he did, but it was taking a lot longer than he wanted. So Polk ordered him to return to the U.S. Trist knew that he was close to a breakthrough, with the Mexican leaders disobeyed and stayed to finalize the treaty. When the treaty was signed, Polk didn't know what it said, or that it was even finalized until messengers got back to him. Publicly, Polk approved of the treaty, but in private he was furious. He wanted even more land from Mexico. As soon as Trist was back with Polk, he was fired for disobeying the order to come home. Trist didn't get pay for his part in ending the war until 1871. Effects of the war on America. Although the Americans won every major battle in the war, they also suffered large losses. 79,000 Americans fought in the conflict and 13,200 died. This might not sound like all that many, but that's a mortality rate of 17%. Of all the conflicts America has been a part of, only the Civil War has a higher mortality rate. Rather than fighting, most of the deaths came from disease. Dysentery, yellow fever, malaria, and smallpox were all very common causes of death among the camps. Many of the leaders of the time, including Ulysses S. Grant, saw the Mexican-American War as the precursor to the Civil War. Even before the conflict with Mexico, tensions between pro-slavery and anti-slavery states were high. The addition of so many new territories to the Union was contentious. Would they allow slavery or not? Neither side of the issue wanted the other to have any sort of advantage. Many future Civil War leaders from both sides saw their first combat during this war, including George Meade, George McClellan, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson, along with future presidents Zachary Taylor, Franklin Pierce, and Ulysses S. Grant. Did you know any of these crazy facts? Be sure to give this video a thumbs up. If you like this type of content, be sure to follow our channel for more crazy history.